The chandeliers at Wexford House blazed like fallen stars, casting diamond light across silk and jewels and barely concealed ambition. Lady Clarissa Winford stood frozen in sapphire blue, her hand white-knuckled around her fan, as Lord Sebastian Rowley's voice cut through the music with surgical precision. "Still single, Lady Clarissa?" The nearby conversations died. Heads turned. Sebastian's smile was all sharp edges and casual cruelty, the expression of a man who believed himself untouchable. His wife Lydia glittered at his side, satisfaction gleaming in her china blue eyes. Clarissa felt the old humiliation rising in her throat, the memory of being discarded, of watching him choose coin over conscience, of rebuilding herself from the wreckage of broken promises. Then she felt something else. A warm, possessive hand settled at her waist. A presence at her back, solid as stone, radiating quiet fury. "I beg your pardon," a voice said, silk over steel. "You are addressing my wife." The ballroom tilted. Sebastian's face drained of colour, and Clarissa realized that the most powerful duke in England was standing behind her, claiming her, protecting her, and about to destroy the man who had once made her believe she wasn't good enough. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, we must go back 2 years. Back to the season when Clarissa Winford learned the hard way that pretty words cost nothing, and that some men trade hearts like currency. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to our main character. Spring, 1812. London society opened its arms to Lady Clarissa Winford with polite interest and modest expectations. At 20, she possessed what her mother called quiet distinction. Dark chestnut hair that caught amber light, intelligent grey eyes that noticed everything, and a grace born of genuine kindness rather than calculated performance. Her father's estate in Derbyshire was respectable without being grand. Her dowry adequate without inspiring competition. She had not expected to become the obsession of Lord Sebastian Rowley. Viscount Rowley, heir to the Marquis of Redcliffe, was everything Clarissa had been raised to recognize as desirable, handsome, charming, politically connected, and pursued by every ambitious mamma in Mayfair. When he chose her from the crowded assembly at Lady Wetherby's ball, asking for not 1 dance but 3, London took notice. "You have something the others lack," he told her that first evening, his blue eyes earnest as he guided her through the waltz. "Intelligence, substance. So many young ladies think only of fashion and gossip. You actually have thoughts worth hearing." Clarissa had felt herself bloom under his attention like a flower turning toward unexpected sun. Over the following weeks, Sebastian pursued her with determination that set tongues wagging. He drove her through Hyde Park in his phaeton. He called at Ashford House with such frequency that even her practical father began to hint at expectations. He engaged her in long conversations about poetry and philosophy, making her believe, foolish, trusting girl that she was, that he valued her mind as much as her person. "You're different, Clarissa," he said one afternoon in her family's drawing room, reaching for her hand with what seemed like genuine feeling. "When I'm with you, I feel like I can be more than just the heir fulfilling obligations. You make me want to be better." She had allowed herself to hope, to dream, to imagine a future as Lady Rowley, not for the title or the wealth, but because she genuinely believed Sebastian saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. Then Miss Lydia Harcourt arrived in London like a golden comet trailing money. The daughter of a merchant who'd purchased his baronetcy with factory profits, Lydia brought a dowry of £50,000 and her father's ruthless ambition to see her marry into the aristocracy. She was beautiful in the conventional way, golden ringlets, porcelain skin, a figure that drew admiring glances, and she entered society with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and precisely what it cost. Clarissa watched Sebastian's attention shift with the inevitability of weather. Within a fortnight, he was dancing attendance on Miss Harcourt. Within a month, he was calling on her family daily, his visits to Ashford House growing shorter and less frequent until they stopped entirely. The rejection, when it came, was public and devastating. At the Duchess of Richmond's ball, one of the grandest events of the season, Sebastian approached Clarissa as she stood near the refreshment table, attempting to appear unconcerned while her world crumbled around her. "Lady Clarissa," he said, his tone carefully modulated to sound regretful, but speaking just loud enough that nearby guests could hear every word. "I hope you'll forgive my recent inattention. I've been much occupied with family matters." She had known what was coming, had felt it in the pitying glances from other young ladies, in the whispered conversations that ceased when she entered rooms. "I must be honest with you," Sebastian continued, and something in his expression, not quite cruelty, but close, told her he was enjoying this moment of power. "I hold you in high regard, truly. But I've come to realize that my duty to my family must take precedence over personal inclination. The Marquis requires that I make a match which will strengthen our position. I'm sure you understand." The humiliation burned through her like acid. Not just the rejection itself, but the deliberate public nature of it. The way he essentially announced to society that she wasn't good enough, that her modest dowry and unremarkable connections made her unworthy of his continued attention. Several nearby matrons had drawn in sharp breaths. One young lady, Miss Pemberton, who'd always been kind, looked genuinely distressed on Clarissa's behalf, and Lydia Harcourt, standing across the room in cloth of gold, smiled behind her fan like a cat who'd secured the cream. "I understand perfectly, Lord Rowley," Clarissa managed, her voice steady despite the mortification coursing through her veins. "Thank you for your honesty." She had maintained her composure through the remainder of the ball, had even danced twice more, though she couldn't afterward recall her partner's names or faces. But when her carriage finally pulled away from Richmond House, when the door closed and she was alone in the dark, she had wept until dawn. Sebastian and Lydia's engagement was announced in the Times 6 weeks later. 2 years changed Clarissa Winford in ways both visible and hidden. She returned to London for the subsequent seasons, but approached society with new eyes, clear, guarded, undeceived. She conversed politely, danced when asked, and deflected questions about her matrimonial prospects with practiced grace. The romantic girl who'd believed in poetry and promises was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that in her world, love was a luxury few could afford. She received offers, a baronet of middling years and boring conversation, a clergyman with more piety than warmth, a third son seeking a competent wife to manage his modest household and moderate expectations. She declined them all. Her mother grew increasingly anxious. "Clarissa, darling, you're 22 now. One cannot afford to be too particular at your age, not with your dowry." But Clarissa had made herself a promise. If she must marry for practical reasons, and her dwindling options suggested she must, then she would at least ensure the match provided genuine security and respect. She would never again make herself vulnerable to a man who might discard her when something better came along. She had not expected a proposal from Gabriel Lindale, Duke of Evermere. The Duke was a legend in English society, though not the romantic sort that inspired sighs from debutantes. At 32, he'd held his title for 14 years, inheriting at 18 when his father died in a riding accident. He'd taken a duchy on the brink of financial ruin and transformed it into one of the wealthiest estates in England through shrewd management and tireless work. He was known for his intelligence, his political influence in the House of Lords, and his absolute refusal to suffer fools. He attended balls and dinners as duty required, but remained aloof, dancing once or twice per evening out of obligation, conversing only when necessary. His dark hair, striking green eyes, and tall, commanding figure made him attractive, but his cold demeanor ensured most young ladies found him intimidating rather than appealing. "Too serious," they whispered, "like talking to a marble statue." Clarissa had met him only 3 times before he called upon her father. The first occasion had been at a political dinner hosted by Lord Castlereagh, where Clarissa accompanied her parents more out of familial duty than enthusiasm. The Duke had been seated near her father, and they'd engaged in discussion about tenant farm management. Clarissa, having recently read a treatise on agricultural improvements, had contributed an observation about crop rotation. The Duke had fixed her with those penetrating green eyes for a long moment before nodding thoughtfully. "An intelligent point, Lady Clarissa. Your father is fortunate to have a daughter who takes interest in such practical matters." It had been matter of fact rather than flattering, but something in his tone suggested genuine respect. The second meeting occurred at the theatre, where chance arrangement of boxes placed the Winfords adjacent to the Duke's party. During the interval, he'd inquired about her opinion of the performance, a new production of The School for Scandal, and she'd offered a critique of the lead actress's interpretation. What should have been polite small talk transformed into an unexpectedly engaging conversation about Sheridan's wit and social commentary. "You have a sharp eye for subtext," the Duke had remarked as the curtain rose for the second act. "Most people merely laugh without understanding what they're laughing at." The third meeting had been at Lady Sefton's garden party just 1 week ago. Clarissa had been standing near the rose arbor, seeking a moment's respite from the relentless social performance, when the Duke had approached. "Lady Clarissa," he said without preamble, as if they were continuing a conversation rather than starting one. "I wonder if I might speak with you frankly." "Of course, Your Grace." She'd been curious but not alarmed. "I find myself in need of a wife." He stated it as directly as he might have commented on the weather. "I require someone intelligent, well-mannered, and capable of managing a ducal household. Someone who will not bore me with frivolous conversation or harbor romantic illusions about our arrangement." Clarissa had stared at him, momentarily speechless. "I've observed you over these past months," the Duke continued, apparently unbothered by her silence. "I believe you possess the qualities I seek. You're sensible, educated, and seem remarkably unimpressed by flattery, a rare virtue among young ladies of your station." He paused, studying her with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "I'm aware this is unorthodox, but I prefer directness to the usual charade of courtship. My position and wealth would provide you with security and social prominence. Your intelligence and dignity would provide me with a suitable duchess. I would expect discretion, competence, and civility. In return, I would offer respect, generous financial provision, and freedom to pursue your own interests within the bounds of propriety." "You're proposing marriage, Your Grace?" Clarissa had asked, still attempting to process this extraordinary conversation. "I'm proposing a practical arrangement that would benefit us both," he corrected. "I don't offer romantic declarations or promises of affection, but I do offer honesty and a partnership based on mutual respect. Whatever else our marriage might be, it would be honorable." That simple statement, delivered without dramatics or false sentiment, had somehow meant more than any flowery declaration could have. Clarissa spent 2 sleepless nights considering the Duke's proposal, making lists of advantages and disadvantages, consulting her anxious mother and skeptical father. In the end, she made her decision based on one simple realization. She no longer believed in romantic love. Sebastian Rowley had cured her of that delusion. If she must marry, and at 22 with a modest dowry, her options would only diminish, then she would choose a marriage based on honesty rather than pretty lies. She sent word to the Duke that she would accept. They were married 3 days later by special license in the drawing room of Ashford House. It was the most unromantic wedding imaginable, brief, businesslike, witnessed only by immediate family. The Duke spoke his vows in a clear, firm voice. He kissed her cheek chastely when the ceremony concluded. "Well then, Duchess," he'd said, the title still strange to Clarissa's ears. "Shall we proceed to the wedding breakfast?" As Clarissa signed her name in the register, Clarissa Winford Lindale, Duchess of Evermere, she felt not disappointment, but relief. She had made a sensible choice. She would be safe, secure, and respected. She had not anticipated facing Sebastian Rowley quite so soon. The ball at Wexford House was one of the first major social events of the season, and attendance was mandatory for anyone who mattered in London society. Clarissa hadn't wanted to attend. She and Gabriel had been married only 3 days, and she felt unprepared for the scrutiny and whispers that were sure to follow their appearance. But Gabriel had been firm. "We will attend," he'd said over breakfast in his townhouse in Berkeley Square. "Society will gossip regardless. Better to appear together, unified and indifferent to their speculation." He'd looked at her across the table, his green eyes steady. "You're the Duchess of Evermere now, Clarissa. Hold your head high." So she'd dressed in deep sapphire silk that her mother insisted made her look regal. Gabriel's wedding gift to her, a magnificent set of sapphires that had belonged to his grandmother, glittered at her throat and ears. When she descended the stairs to meet him in the entrance hall, she'd caught a flash of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps approval, before his expression returned to its usual controlled politeness. "You look very well," he'd said, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The carriage ride had been brief and largely silent, Gabriel preoccupied with his thoughts, Clarissa too nervous to attempt conversation. When they arrived and the butler's voice rang out across the ballroom, the reaction was immediate. His Grace, the Duke of Evermere, and Her Grace, the Duchess of Evermere. Clarissa felt dozens of eyes turn toward them simultaneously, heard the whispers beginning like wind through leaves. Married? When? To whom? Gabriel kept her hand firmly on his arm as they made their way through the receiving line, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. They'd been standing near one of the tall windows, accepting congratulations from Lord and Lady Castlereagh, when Clarissa saw him. Sebastian Rowley stood across the room in evening dress that probably cost more than her father's annual income, his golden hair carefully styled, his handsome face animated as he spoke with a group of gentlemen. Beside him stood Lydia, now Lady Rowley, dressed in white silk and dripping with jewels that likely represented a significant portion of her father's fortune. Clarissa's stomach clenched. She'd known she would eventually encounter Sebastian in society, but she'd hoped for more time to prepare herself. As if sensing her regard, Sebastian looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. He smiled, that same charming, slightly mocking smile she remembered so well, and said something to his wife, who glanced toward Clarissa with poorly concealed disdain. Then he began making his way through the crowd toward them. Clarissa's hand tightened on her fan. Gabriel, who'd been conversing with Lord Castlereagh, glanced down at her. "Are you quite well?" he asked quietly. "Perfectly well," she lied. Sebastian approached with his characteristic confidence, his wife trailing slightly behind like an ornament being displayed. He looked at Clarissa with that familiar expression of false concern, deliberate condescension wrapped in a veneer of politeness. "Lady Clarissa," he said, deliberately using her maiden name, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by nearby guests. "How unexpected to see you here. Still attending these events, I see. The implied insult was clear. Still hoping, still searching, still unclaimed. Before Clarissa could respond, Sebastian continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Still without a husband, I see. What a pity. He smiled, cruelty gleaming beneath the charm. Though I suppose at your age, with your circumstances, it becomes increasingly difficult. Perhaps your expectations are simply too elevated for a young lady with such limited prospects. One must be realistic, after all. The words landed like physical blows. Clarissa heard sharp intakes of breath from nearby guests, saw Lady Sinclair's eyes widen, felt 2 years of carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. Then she felt it. A warm, possessive hand settling at her waist, a solid presence at her side, the subtle scent of sandalwood and something uniquely masculine that she'd already come to recognize as Gabriel. "I beg your pardon," her husband said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet space around them. "I believe you are addressing my wife." Miss Lydia Harcourt arrived in London like a declaration of war wrapped in French silk and armed with £50,000. Society noticed immediately. The whispers began at Almack's and spread like wildfire through every drawing room in Mayfair. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, perfectly arranged, carefully maintained, designed to be admired rather than loved. Clarissa watched Sebastian's attention shift with the sick certainty of someone watching a ship change course in a storm. 1 week, he was driving her through Hyde Park, praising her thoughts on Wordsworth. The next, he was partnering Miss Harcourt through every dance at Lady Jersey's ball, his eyes following the golden ringlets and calculated smile. Within a month, his visits to Ashford House had ceased entirely. The Duchess of Richmond's ball was where Sebastian made his choice public. Clarissa had known it was coming, felt it in the pitying glances from other young ladies, in the way conversations died when she entered rooms. But knowing didn't soften the blow when Sebastian approached her near the refreshment table, speaking just loudly enough that a dozen guests could hear every carefully chosen word. "Lady Clarissa, I hope you'll forgive my recent inattention. I've been occupied with family matters." His tone was regretful, but something in his eyes suggested he was enjoying this moment of power. "I must be honest with you. I hold you in high regard, truly. But I've come to realize that my duty to my family must take precedence over personal inclination. The Marquis requires that I make a match which will strengthen our position. I'm sure you understand." The humiliation burned through her like acid. Not just the rejection, but the deliberate public nature of it. The way he announced to everyone listening that she wasn't good enough, that her modest dowry made her unworthy of his continued attention. Several matrons drew in sharp breaths. Miss Pemberton looked genuinely distressed on her behalf. And across the room, Lydia Harcourt smiled behind her fan like a cat who'd secured the cream. "I understand perfectly, Lord Rowley," Clarissa managed, her voice steady despite everything crumbling inside her. "Thank you for your honesty." She held herself together through the remainder of the ball, even danced twice more with partners whose names she couldn't afterward recall. But when her carriage door finally closed and she was alone in the dark, she wept until dawn, until her eyes were swollen and her throat raw, and there were no tears left. Then, as the sun rose over London, Clarissa Winford made herself a promise. Love was a luxury she could no longer afford. If she must marry, it would be for security and respect, never again for the beautiful lies men told when it served their purposes. 2 years changed everything and nothing. Clarissa returned to London each season, but approached society with new eyes, clear, guarded, undeceived. She conversed politely, danced when asked, and deflected questions about matrimonial prospects with practiced grace. The romantic girl who'd believed in poetry was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that in her world, sentiment was a poor substitute for security. Suitors appeared, a baronet of middling years who spoke only of his hunting dogs, a clergyman with more piety than warmth, a third son seeking a competent wife to manage his modest household. She declined them all. Her mother grew increasingly anxious. "You're 22 now, darling. One cannot afford to be too particular." But Clarissa refused to settle for another mistake. Gabriel Lindale, Duke of Evermere, had been watching from the edges of society for months. Tall, forbidding, with piercing green eyes that missed nothing, he had a reputation for ruthless competence in business and politics. Most young ladies found him intimidating. Clarissa found him refreshingly direct. At Lord Castlereagh's political dinner, he'd spoken to her about tenant farms and parliamentary reform, clearly impressed when she contributed intelligent observations rather than vapid pleasantries. "You have a practical mind, Lady Clarissa," he'd said. "That's rare and valuable." Days later, he appeared at Ashford House and requested a private audience with her father. When Clarissa was summoned to her father's study, Gabriel stood by the window silhouetted against the afternoon light. "Lady Clarissa," he began without preamble, "I find myself in need of a wife. I require someone intelligent, capable of managing a ducal household, and sensible enough not to harbor romantic illusions about our arrangement." He turned to face her directly. "I'm offering a practical partnership based on mutual respect, clear expectations, and security. I cannot promise affection, but I can promise honesty and a position no one will dare challenge. Your intelligence would benefit me. My protection and resources would benefit you." Clarissa studied him carefully. No pretty words, no false promises. Just brutal honesty about what he wanted and what he could offer. "I accept," she said quietly, because honesty, she'd learned, was worth more than poetry, and security was worth more than love. Clarissa Winford became Duchess of Evermere in a ceremony so small and swift it barely qualified as a wedding. Only immediate family attended. No society gossip, no elaborate breakfast, no romantic declarations. Just solemn vows spoken in the Ashford House drawing room, a chaste kiss when the vicar pronounced them married, and a new title that felt strangely heavy on her shoulders. At Evermere House in Berkeley Square, the housekeeper Mrs. Hathaway greeted them with barely concealed surprise and secret pleasure. "Welcome home, Your Grace," she said to Clarissa, her eyes warm. "We're delighted His Grace has finally taken a bride." Mr. Cole, the valet, bowed formally, but Clarissa caught the hint of approval in his expression. The staff, it seemed, had been hoping their remote duke would marry. Gabriel showed her through the house with courteous formality, pointing out the library, the morning room, her private sitting room. "Your chambers are adjoining mine," he said, opening a door to reveal an elegantly appointed bedroom in shades of cream and gold. "But you need not worry. I won't intrude on your privacy unless you wish it." They established routines quickly, separate bedchambers, formal breakfasts where they discussed household matters and Gabriel's schedule, polite distance maintained at all times. Gabriel spent his days at his club or in Parliament. Clarissa managed household affairs and received a few cautious callers. In the evenings, they sometimes sat together in the library, both reading in companionable silence. It was exactly what they'd agreed to. A practical arrangement, a marriage of mutual benefit and careful boundaries. So why did Clarissa sometimes catch herself watching Gabriel across the breakfast table, noticing the way morning light caught in his dark hair, wondering what thoughts moved behind those intelligent green eyes? And why did Gabriel's gaze linger on her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unreadable but somehow softer than his usual controlled mask? Neither spoke of it. They'd made a bargain, and both were determined to honor its terms, even if, in the quiet moments before sleep, Each wondered privately whether they'd negotiated away something they might have wanted after all. When the ornate invitation to the Wexford ball arrived, Clarissa felt her stomach tighten with dread. "Must we attend?" she asked Gabriel over breakfast. "We've been married only 3 days." "We must," Gabriel said firmly, setting down his newspaper. "Society will gossip regardless of what we do. Better to appear together, unified and indifferent to their speculation." His green eyes met hers steadily. "You're the Duchess of Evermere now, Clarissa. Let them see us together. Gossip dies quicker in the open." Jane, her maid, dressed her in sapphire silk that made her grey eyes luminous. The Duchess jewels, Gabriel's grandmother's sapphires, glittered at her throat and ears, a fortune in gems that announced her new status more clearly than any introduction could. When Clarissa descended the staircase, Gabriel was waiting in the entrance hall. His controlled expression slipped for just a heartbeat as he looked up at her, something flashing in his eyes that might have been admiration before the mask returned. "You look very well," he said quietly, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The carriage ride was brief and tense. Clarissa's hands trembled slightly in her lap, until Gabriel's larger hand covered hers, warm and steady. "Breathe," he murmured. "You have nothing to fear. You're a duchess now. No one will dare slight you." When they arrived at Wexford House, and the butler's voice rang out, "His Grace, the Duke of Evermere," and Her Grace, the Duchess of Evermere, the reaction was immediate. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Clarissa felt dozens of eyes fix on them as whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Married? When? To whom? Gabriel kept her hand firmly on his arm as they moved through the receiving line. The Duke and Duchess of Wexford greeted them warmly, though curiosity burned in their eyes. "How delightful to see you married at last, Evermere," the Duke said, "and to such a charming bride." Inside the ballroom, they were immediately surrounded by well-wishers and the curious. Society matrons angled for introductions. Gentlemen studied Gabriel with new interest, clearly reassessing the political implications of his marriage. Young ladies whispered behind fans, wondering how unremarkable Lady Clarissa Winford had secured the most aloof duke in England. Clarissa held her head high, smiled politely, and tried to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in her chest. Because somewhere in this glittering crowd was the man who'd once made her believe she was special, then taught her exactly how little that meant. If this story has touched your heart, please don't just watch and leave. Hit that subscribe button. We're so close to 5,000 subscribers, and your click makes all the difference. Like this video, share it with someone who loves epic romance, and drop a comment telling us what you think of Clarissa and Gabriel. Your support keeps these stories coming. Don't let us tell these tales to an empty room. Subscribe now. Clarissa saw Sebastian before he saw her. He stood across the ballroom in evening dress that probably cost more than her father's annual income, his golden hair perfectly styled, his handsome face animated as he laughed with a group of gentlemen. Beside him, Lydia, now Lady Rowley, glittered in white silk and jewels, looking perpetually dissatisfied despite having everything she'd schemed for. Clarissa's stomach clenched, but she refused to look away. Some perverse part of her needed to face this, to prove to herself that he no longer had power over her. As if sensing her regard, Sebastian looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded room. He smiled. That same charming, slightly cruel smile she remembered, and said something to his wife. Lydia glanced toward Clarissa with poorly concealed disdain, then smirked. Sebastian began making his way through the crowd with that familiar, careless confidence, his wife trailing behind like an ornament being displayed. Clarissa's hand tightened on her fan. Beside her, Gabriel had been conversing with Lord Castlereagh, but he glanced down at her now. "Are you quite well?" he asked quietly. "Perfectly well," she lied. Sebastian approached with the air of someone about to enjoy himself immensely. He looked directly at Clarissa, pointedly ignoring Gabriel, and spoke just loudly enough that nearby guests could hear every word. "Lady Clarissa," he said, deliberately using her maiden name. "How unexpected to see you here. Still attending these events, I see." The implied insult was clear. Still hoping, still searching, still unclaimed. Clarissa felt heat rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, Sebastian continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Still without a husband, I see. What a pity. Though I suppose at your age with your circumstances it becomes increasingly difficult." He smiled, cruelty gleaming beneath the charm. "Perhaps your expectations are simply too elevated for a young lady with such limited prospects. One must be realistic after all." The words landed like blows. Clarissa heard sharp intakes of breath from nearby guests, saw Lady Sinclair's eyes widen, felt 2 years of carefully constructed composure beginning to crack, the old humiliation rising in her throat. Then she felt it. A warm, possessive hand settling at her waist. A solid presence at her side. Gabriel's voice, silk over steel, cutting through the suddenly quiet space. "I beg your pardon," he said, each word precisely enunciated. "I believe you are addressing my wife." Sebastian froze. His smile faltering. "Your wife?" "Indeed." Gabriel's tone was perfectly polite, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. "Allow me to introduce myself properly. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Evermere. And this," his hand tightened slightly at Clarissa's waist, "is my Duchess, Clarissa Winford Lindale, formerly Lady Clarissa Ashford. We were married 3 days ago." The silence that descended was absolute. Clarissa watched colour drain from Sebastian's face, saw his eyes dart from Gabriel to her and back again, clearly struggling to process this information. "The Duke of Evermere," Sebastian managed, his voice strangled. "Forgive me, You are?" Gabriel interrupted, his tone now carrying an edge of disdain. The cut was deliberate and devastating. Pretending not to know a marquis's heir was an insult of the highest order. "Lord James Hartley," Sebastian stammered. "Heir to the Marquis of Redcliffe. This is my wife, Lady Hartley." "Ah, yes," Gabriel said, as if only now recalling. "I believe I'm acquainted with your father. A decent man, if somewhat burdened by unfortunate investments of late. I trust he is in good health?" Another calculated cut, referencing rumours that the Marquis's fortune had been significantly diminished. Sebastian seemed unable to formulate a response. Lydia looked equally mortified, her earlier smugness replaced by panic. "I must commend your confidence, Lord Hartley," Gabriel continued, his voice dangerously soft. "To approach my wife and suggest she has limited prospects shows remarkable boldness. Ignorance, certainly, but remarkable nonetheless." He paused, letting the words sink in. "My wife's prospects, I assure you, are quite satisfactory. As Duchess of Evermere, she now ranks above every woman in this room save royalty. Her position is secure, her future is assured, and she is," he fixed Sebastian with a look of undisguised contempt, "far too valuable to waste another moment on inconsequential conversation." With that, Gabriel smoothly guided Clarissa away, leaving Sebastian and his wife standing alone in a circle of fascinated onlookers. Clarissa could feel the eyes following them, hear the whispers beginning like a rising tide. Where Sebastian had sought to humiliate her publicly, Gabriel had instead elevated her and simultaneously destroyed Sebastian's pretensions with surgical precision. As they stepped onto the terrace, the cool night air a relief after the suffocating ballroom, Clarissa realized she was trembling. Not with humiliation this time, but with something else entirely. Relief, vindication, and a fierce, unexpected gratitude toward the man standing beside her. "Thank you," she whispered, You didn't have to do that." Gabriel turned to face her, his green eyes intense in the moonlight. "Yes," he said quietly. "I did." By noon the next day, all of London was talking. The story had spread like wildfire through drawing rooms and clubs, how the Duke of Evermere had publicly destroyed Lord Hartley for insulting his new Duchess, how he'd defended her with controlled fury that was somehow more devastating than rage. Clarissa's humiliation had been rewritten overnight into a legend of the Duke's fierce protection. Lady Beatrice Ravenshaw called that afternoon, sweeping into Clarissa's sitting room with the confidence of someone who ruled London society through sheer force of personality. "My dear Duchess," she said, kissing Clarissa's cheek, "you've become the most talked-about woman in England, and Evermere has reminded everyone why crossing him is political suicide." She settled into a chair, studying Clarissa with sharp, approving eyes. "Now, let me teach you how to wield the power you've just been given." Over tea, Lady Beatrice explained the delicate architecture of social influence, who to cultivate, who to politely ignore, how to use an invitation or its absence as a weapon. "You're no longer the girl waiting to be chosen," she said. "You're a duchess. People will petition you now. Use that wisely." The next week proved her right. Clarissa received a flood of invitations, calling cards, and requests for her patronage of various charitable causes. At Lady Jersey's tea, she was tested by women like Lady Honoria Sinclair, who watched her with assessing eyes, probing for weakness or pretension. Clarissa met their scrutiny calmly, answering questions with intelligence and quiet confidence. She was learning to inhabit her new position, to understand that she no longer needed anyone's approval to validate her worth. But the real change was happening inside Evermere House. Gabriel had begun showing her small kindnesses that felt oddly intimate. He arranged for her breakfast to be served at exactly the temperature she preferred. He left books in her sitting room, not frivolous novels but works of philosophy and political economy, with notes in the margins where he thought she'd find particular passages interesting. He invited her to meetings with Mr. Pritchard, his man of business, explaining complex financial matters with patience and apparent pleasure in her sharp questions. "You have a head for figures," Mr. Pritchard told her one afternoon, genuine respect in his voice. "His Grace is fortunate." Clarissa was beginning to see past Gabriel's stern exterior to something more complex underneath. The lonely man who'd built walls around himself, who treated duty as armor against feeling. Late at night, reading in the library while he worked on correspondence, she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something warmer than respect. Something that made her pulse quicken. She was starting to wonder if their practical arrangement was becoming something neither of them had bargained for. Something that felt dangerously like caring. Clarissa returned from the charitable school in Southwark, covered in dust and exhausted. She'd spent the afternoon helping organize the new schoolroom, moving furniture and arranging books alongside the staff and children. When she entered Evermere House through the side entrance, hoping to slip upstairs unnoticed, she nearly collided with Gabriel in the hallway. "Good God," he said, his eyes widening. "What happened to you?" "The orphanage," Clarissa replied, suddenly self-conscious about her disheveled appearance. "We were setting up the new schoolroom. I'm afraid I got rather more involved than was strictly necessary." "You were moving furniture?" His frown deepened. "Clarissa, you have servants for such tasks." "The children were so excited. I could hardly stand by doing nothing." She smiled despite her exhaustion. "Besides, I'm perfectly capable of moving a few chairs." Gabriel stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving across his face. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a genuine laugh that transformed his usually stern features. "You're extraordinary," he said, his hands settling on her shoulders. "Most duchesses would consider it beneath their dignity to even visit such establishments. You roll up your sleeves and work alongside the staff." "Then most duchesses are missing the satisfaction of genuine accomplishment," Clarissa replied. Something shifted in Gabriel's expression. His hands slid from her shoulders to gently frame her face, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "Come to my study," he said quietly. "We need to talk." In the book-lined study, Gabriel poured her a glass of wine and stood before her, struggling visibly with unfamiliar emotions. "I need you to understand something," he began. "I will not tolerate anyone diminishing you, Clarissa. Not society gossips, not former suitors, and not yourself. You treat your own comfort and safety as irrelevant, throwing yourself into charitable work until you're exhausted. It concerns me." "And you," Clarissa countered, finding unexpected courage. "Treat your own happiness as if it doesn't matter. You've built your entire life around duty and obligation, never allowing yourself to want anything just for yourself." They stared at each other, both breathing slightly harder, the truth hanging between them like something fragile and dangerous. Then Gabriel smiled, rueful, almost vulnerable. "We're a matched pair of fools, aren't we?" Clarissa laughed, surprising herself. "Perhaps we are." The tension broke, but something else remained. A connection that felt suddenly more honest, more real than all their careful politeness. They talked for hours that evening, sharing thoughts they'd never voiced, admitting fears they'd never acknowledged. When Clarissa finally retired to her chamber, she lay awake in the darkness, wondering when respect had begun to look suspiciously like love. In the adjoining room, Gabriel lay equally sleepless, thinking the same thing. The scandal, when it came, was both predictable and vicious. Someone, Clarissa suspected Sebastian, nursing his wounded pride, began spreading rumors that she'd trapped the Duke into marriage, that she'd used some manipulation to secure a position far above her station. The whispers followed her through drawing rooms and dinner parties, subtle but poisonous. Gabriel's political enemies seized the opportunity, attempting to use Clarissa to gather information about his parliamentary positions and business dealings. At Lady Cowper's musicale, a gentleman cornered her, asking seemingly innocent questions that were clearly designed to extract information. Clarissa had a choice. She could retreat behind Gabriel's protection, playing the role of helpless wife, or she could step forward as his partner. The next Wexford ball became her battlefield. When she overheard Lady Pemberton and two other women discussing the rumors in hushed voices, Clarissa approached them directly. "I understand there's been speculation about my marriage," she said calmly. "Allow me to clarify. The Duke proposed a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. I accepted because I recognized his integrity and intelligence. If society finds it remarkable that a man might value a woman's mind rather than merely her dowry, perhaps that says more about society than about my marriage." The women stared at her, mouths slightly agape. Then Lady Pemberton smiled. "Well said, Your Grace. Well said indeed." Word spread quickly. The Duchess of Evermere was no one's pawn. She was articulate, confident, and fiercely loyal to her husband. That night, when they returned to Evermere House, Gabriel drew her into his study and closed the door. "What you did tonight," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Defending me, defending us. Clarissa, I need you to know something." "Yes?" "I married you for practical reasons," he admitted, stepping closer. "I told myself I wanted intelligence and competence. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being an arrangement. You've become essential to me. I love you, Clarissa. Fiercely. Completely. In a way I didn't know I was capable of loving anyone." Clarissa felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm tired of pretending I don't care," she whispered. "I love you too, Gabriel. You've shown me what real devotion looks like. Not pretty words, but consistent action. Not grand gestures, but daily kindness." When he kissed her, it was nothing like their chaste wedding kiss. It was passionate, demanding, a release of weeks of carefully controlled feeling. "No more separate chambers," Gabriel murmured against her lips. "I want you beside me. Always." "Always," Clarissa agreed. Their marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement, had become something neither had dared hope for. A true partnership. A genuine love match. A choice they made together, every day. 3 years later, the summer garden party at Ravenshaw Manor was the event of the season. Clarissa and Gabriel arrived with their daughter Charlotte, a bright-eyed 2-year-old with her father's dark hair and her mother's grey eyes. They were openly affectionate now, their partnership famous throughout London as rare and enviable. Gabriel kept his hand at Clarissa's waist, smiling down at her with undisguised adoration. Charlotte tugged at her mother's skirt, chattering excitedly about the flowers. Across the lawn, Sebastian Rowley stood with his wife, both looking older and distinctly unhappy. His father's financial troubles had worsened. Lydia's disappointment in her marriage was evident in every pinched expression. They watched the Duke and Duchess of Evermere with something that looked suspiciously like regret. For the first time, Sebastian truly understood what he'd lost when he chose wealth over character. He'd traded Clarissa's genuine affection for Lydia's dowry, and spent every day since living with that bargain. Clarissa noticed him watching, and met his eyes across the lawn. There was no triumph in her gaze, no cruelty, just calm indifference. She had everything she'd ever wanted, a partner who cherished her, a daughter they both adored, a life built on honest affection rather than pretty lies. Sebastian Rowley had taught her what love wasn't, and in doing so had led her to discover what love actually was. Gabriel leaned down to whisper something in her ear that made her laugh. Charlotte squealed with delight at something in the flower bed, and Clarissa realized with perfect clarity that she'd never been still single at all. She'd been waiting, without knowing it, for a man who would see her worth and stand beside her, not above her. A man who valued partnership over possession, intelligence over ornament, genuine affection over shallow charm. Sebastian had mocked her, suggesting she had no prospects. He'd been spectacularly wrong. She hadn't just secured a position above anything he could have offered. She'd found something infinitely more valuable. Real love, with a man who cherished her completely. As they walked back toward the house, Gabriel's arm around her waist, Charlotte's small hand in hers, Clarissa felt only gratitude. For the humiliation that had taught her strength, for the practical proposal that had become passionate love, for the Duke who'd promised only honesty and given her everything. She was Clarissa Winford Lindale, Duchess of Evermere, and she had never been happier. This is what true love looks like. Not fairy tales, but two people choosing each other every single day. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in second chances and honest partnerships, then don't just walk away. Smash that subscribe button right now. We're building something special here, and we need you to be part of it. Like this video, drop a comment telling us your favorite moment, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story. Your support literally keeps these tales alive. Next week, we're bringing you another unforgettable romance that will leave you breathless. A story of forbidden love, dangerous secrets, and a woman who refuses to be broken. You won't want to miss it. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're first to know when it drops. Thank you for staying until the very end. Thank you for believing in love stories that feel real. Thank you for being here. Now go subscribe, and we'll see you in the next chapter of Legendary Romance.